Scott Williams, CEO of Maga Design. Thanks for joining us today on Fuse Calls.
Hello there.
Hello.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, no problem. So you're the CEO and the founder of Maga Design. Can you summarize what Maga Design does, how you got started in this particular line of work? I'm a bit interested in the specifics of what you guys do, and where exactly does the name MAGA come from? Because I don't think it's Make America Great Again.
No. We say MAGA.
MAGA.
And yeah, it's an Italian word that means magician. So I started the firm over 14 years ago, and I was with the Navy for many years, and they used to say I was a magician with slides. And so it was sort of, and it's kind of funny because we spend so much of our time trying to kill PowerPoint and not use PowerPoint, but that's where that name came from. And but we really have sort of run with this idea of magic and creating a kind of an X factor in our client spaces. And so yeah, the current topic in the news sphere is not related to us at all.
Okay. I did not know that. MAGA means magician in Italian, so learn something new every day there. What did you do in the Navy? Just curious.
So I was a deputy CIO, so I came out of the IT world. And, I actually had the chance through a executive development program to come into contact with Tom Peters, the business author, back in the day.
Yeah.
At that point in time, Tom was talking a lot about this idea of brand, the brand called You, and developing brands. And I had the chance to work with his organization and actually, the chance to partner with a lot of folks. Julie Annixter is a person who I came into contact with as well. And ended up creating a enterprise branding project for the Navy, or at least for a part of the Navy called Naval Aviation, or NavAir. And so what I really found was really two sort of competing forces, or two forces that were playing out at the same time. One was, we were at this moment in the software world where we were moving away from all these sort of bespoke websites and web applications and moving more to enterprise package applications like Oracle or SAP. And so we had a lot of creative folks that were sort of kind of not as excited about, implementing something that's out of the box versus building their own thing. And then two, we were really realizing that for enterprise change, it wasn't what was the ones and zeros in the coding, it was all of the culture change. And so was there a way to sort of build an internal communications or internal brand apparatus that could really help gain adoption on large, complex projects? And so I did that work with the Navy, and ultimately retired and started MAGA doing that very same thing. So
what year did you leave the Navy and start MAGA? Just curious. That was
2004.
2004. And I have a brother-in-law who he flew the A6 fighter. I think sounds like before your time.
Yeah, a little earlier. Yeah.
Yeah, he flew those in Desert Storm. So interesting. So when you're talking about brand apparatus, I mean, I've done a little investigation into the work you guys do. It seems like there's a lot of emphasis on like infographic type of work. What do you mean by brand apparatus? Just curious when you're doing that type of work.
Well, I mean, our position on brand is really, and I can talk a little bit about the super graphics, as Edward Tufte would say, or the Maga Maps. So we productized this as a Maga Map. And really, I like to say it was sort of an engagement in a box. And so there were a lot of the things that we did that had to do with sort of how we priced it and how we created this engagement in a box. But underneath of it, it looks like a large illustrated, almost like a comic book brought to life for an organization. But I like to say that there were 3 or 4 pretty sophisticated things going on sort of underneath of this. One was definitely about brand. And so when I say brand apparatus, I guess my point is our position on brand is that we're there to do one of 3 things everywhere we go. We're either there to create a new brand where one doesn't exist, enforce an existing brand. So we've done work with Pepsi and Dell and some pretty large organizations, or to extend a brand that might be weakened or needs some strengthening. And so probably on every project that we're doing, while what the client might be seeing is this sort of roadmap or journey to the future, there's an awful lot of research and a lot of, I'll say, brand related activity going on as well.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, well, I'm sure we'll get to this with some of the other questions, but it seems like your model is you absorb a ton of information ahead of the game and try to distill it into a kind of its simplest visual form. Is that kind of a
That's a good way
fair
to put
thing to
it.
say?
Yep.
Okay.
And yeah, I mean, to your point, I like to tell people what, like, we're the most technically oriented sort of PR advertising firm that you'll ever meet, and we're also focused very much inside of organizations. We don't do that much work that's externally facing.
Yeah.
But you're right. I mean, in this world of social media and analytics and AI and just data everywhere, what we have found, we've kind of drawn this thing that my friend, the author Dan Rome, compass coined as the double compass. And so the first part of the compass is the who we're working with. And so you kind of think of you in the center, the bosses above, the workforce below, the peer organizations and public, ecosystem partners. That's who we're communicating with. And with all those people, and you're trying to talk about a very complex technology change, like for the United States Postal Service, we were part of implementing 16 billion tracking events a day for mail-in packages. I mean, the
Right.
technology to do that is massive. So how do you boil that down so that those four pieces of that compass I just mentioned, you could communicate the salient parts of it in a way that would stick with people? So yeah,
Okay.
so I'd say I view sort of Dan Rome and his back of the napkin approach, and Dr. Vince Cavello, who is one of the world's leaders on communications under stress or high concern communications, as two of the sort of special sauces that we invoke while we do this work.
So the MAGA tagline reads, "Bringing business and creativity together." Is that your tagline? I was looking through your
That's one.
your
Yeah,
website. One of them.
we like to say that we are idea architects. So I think our tagline is idea architects, but there is a line in there that talks about bringing business and design together. Yes.
Okay. That popped out at me because this is right aligned with one of our themes this year for the Fuse event, which you will be speaking at. As I went through your site, I couldn't help but notice that, as I said before, you're taking all of this massive information, you're distilling it down into simplified form. Why do business professionals need visuals? I feel like this might be obvious to some of us, especially if designers are chiming in, but if we're talking about creating a dialogue with business professionals, and maybe you and I know they need visuals, but they don't know they need visuals, why do you think, how can you kind of create that dialogue with business professionals?
And to your point, even though that the scientific evidence and the industry best practice evidence seems to indicate over and over and over that visualization is so important, I feel like I'm fighting that battle every day. I'm fighting a battle against a spreadsheet and a left brain person every day of why we need the visual piece. I mean, it starts with scientifically, our eyes and our brains are essentially visual processing engines. We process visual information so much faster. We can consume information, much larger volumes of information using visuals. But it's difficult because I would say that I like to joke that in DC will pay New York prices for design, but they won't wait for it. That presentation to Congress, that presentation to the room full of people, the admirals, the generals, it's going to happen on Tuesday, whether that presentation is ready or not. And so a lot of times it's, can we carve enough time and enough resources to get the visual story? But I would say, I think that the visual story lasts longer. I think people can remember it longer. And there's a whole school of thought around this idea called receiver-led communication, where you rather than giving somebody a linear 20-page PowerPoint deck, where now I'm going to dictate to you what order you see the information, on a super graphic or a large-scale map, you can decide what areas of it are most important to you in the small amount of time you have. And so that's one of the reasons I think visualization is so important.
I mean, and you're preaching to the choir here, so you don't need to sell me. I'm a designer. I'm a visual guy myself. But I would just argue as well, people's minds don't process linearly. I mean, some people, they want the bullet point breakdown or whatever. But yeah, for sure. I mean, you have, I've seen your work. You have areas on a visual graphic, and everybody's eyes are going to go to different places on the graphic and kind of absorb things differently. And it just seems to me that that visual just more will cater to a larger audience. You're going to have more absorption of that content more immediately. So yeah, that's the idea. So literally, a picture's worth 1,000 words.
Yeah,
Yeah,
and ultimately, like you said, our eye can take in 10 to 20 times more pixels than a PowerPoint slide. So we can
yeah,
take more in. And I often play a game with people inside the company. We're about 100 folks. We're in 5 offices around the country, and a predominant amount of our work is federal. But I tell people, show me the PowerPoint deck from the executive and show me the most important slide. What's the most important idea or the thing that you want people to walk away from? And often it's buried somewhere. Like, why not just start with and
right.
present that piece of information and kind of begin with the end in mind? Show me the thing up front that you want to be the big idea, and maybe we talk around it. We did a lot of work with Prezi over the years, where Prezi
Yep.
kind of lets you move around a super graphic. I still think, even though some people can get a little vertigo if you don't do it right, the idea of moving around a storyboard versus a linear story certainly, I think, has application.
Interesting. So Maga has seemingly tapped into a specific communication need for businesses with this type of work. I mean, I remember, around that time, I don't recall the exact year, but, it was definitely the mid 2000s to 2010. People were like, hey, do you do infographics? This is a big, and I don't want to oversimplify what you guys do. That's what it looks like. I think on the surface, a lot of infographic type of work. But, uh, you know, can you discuss how business leaders will use visual communication mediums to build momentum for change?
Sure,
Because,
sure. And so to your point, each of the maps that we create, and there is an infographic kind of feel to it, but what we like to think each map is essentially we build a visual lexicon. So in each map, the larger, what we call the full Maga map, there can be as many as 65 to 70 hand-created illustrations that are all a metaphor for usually something more complex. So to take something from the IT world, portfolio management, managing your IT portfolio, or digital transformation. And so we render these ideas in this sort of comic book style form with these families of metaphors and families of visuals. And so there is kind of a style guide that gets created. And then what we really try to do is partner with our clients, where they can now take the elements of that style guide off of the page, and they can put them into training materials, or put them into architecture documents, or put them into communications material. And so there is a kind of, we're building you this sort of branded lexicon. And I have a couple of examples where, we did one for one agency where it started as this like first $60,000 map of visuals, and it ends up leading to like, $7 or $8 million of work, because as they got more and more used to seeing this initiative reflected in that
wow.
way, they wanted it to see it look that way in the training material, and they want to see that way in their process documentation. And so it sort of like filtered down. I like to call it the stairway. It kind of stairway down, and really, I think, really became recognizable in its own right.
Yeah, I've seen this. It's like they didn't know they needed it, and then they couldn't live without it, kind of a thing. Yeah.
Yeah, and I'll say, at the time, we definitely, there was a conference, I think around 2004 or maybe it was 2006, called VizThink out in San Francisco, and folks like Tom Wujek and Dave Gray. And so, certainly Explain, Root Learning, The Grove with David Sivit. I'd like to say we sort of did a mashup of a lot of those firms, where we introduced the graphic facilitation, graphic recording idea that The Grove really created. We certainly Root and how Root has done these learning maps and what they've done. I'd say Root's product though is very highly illustrated. And so we really then really looked to something like Explain, where they created this sort of family of isometric images, and so that's kind of, yeah, we certainly were both flattered to meet and to really learn from a lot of those industry leading agencies. I would say we just really also focused in on how do you do business in the federal government, which is a real big headache, and certainly no one on this podcast would want to listen to.
Well, but I find it to be interesting. I've had this with my own experience. I've been designing for decades now in a company, and I find, if you can kind of tap into your own uniqueness, it all starts to become really interesting. Even the most boring, mundane things, that's, I think, what's kind of nice about being a designer, a creative thinker, that you can find what's interesting in anything. Everything is design. Yeah. So I'm curious though. You started out doing these PowerPoints. How did you go from like doing PowerPoints in the Navy to these like massive visual lexicons, as you put it? So I'll refrain from saying infographics, but I mean, that seems like a bit of a jump. I take it you're talking with these folks as time's going by. So talk a little bit about that journey there.
Yeah, and the thing I would say is I feel really passionate about the idea of a tribe, building a tribe, and whether or not that tribe is people that work in your firm or key customers that you deal with. As a designer, you hear the people that know my style and like my style, but I had a real tribe of people around me that were, some were government, some were, industry, contractors, who started to, trust my storytelling ability, or starting to trust, what I was doing. And I was a pretty technical guy at the time as well. But yeah, the idea of experimenting, I always like to have my eye on sort of what's going on in industry. And as I became more aware of some of the firms and companies I just mentioned, I tried really hard to bring those ideas into the federal sphere. And, I like to think of myself as a continuous learner. And so, but I think it was like having a tribe of people who were willing to let us experiment and try things. And so I think, certainly for MAGA, the fact I had this group in the Navy that would let me try these ideas and give them a whirl. And I would say, there was this kind of key moment where I was now out of the Navy, but I was working with them as a contractor, where, the admiral comes in, and how many times in every organization does this happen? The boss just put down the new template. Everyone is supposed to fill out this template for the, their monthly update, and 42-page template, and please fill it out exactly the same as the guy next to you. And the CIO at the time went in to present to the three-star admiral, like, their plans for cybersecurity, like 4 times, and in 4 times he or she was sort of didn't get past slide 2. And so I said, let me take this chance. Let me see if I could build you a map of this deck, and see if you couldn't walk in there like a heads-up display and lay it down in front of him, and see if you can't get him to engage. And so I kind of talked him into it, and he walked in, and
Wow.
And literally I had an order for 10 more maps like a week later.
So, I mean, was this like literally like, I picture an admiral with a map, kind of like that, literally like that, the admiral's view. I'm looking at everything at once. I mean, is that the kind of thing you were thinking about? Like, this is what this.
Yeah, and definitely, it's funny because those first couple ones early on, and most people in the firm won't claim them as MAGA, but yeah, I mean, they were. But it's interesting too, because we started to sort of get to this look where, like, we would always create this vision lane at the top, and the idea of the vision lane was sort of where we're all going together, and we spent so much time. We had seized upon a metaphor, which I think was like a Gartner metaphor around city planning, and we sort of put this vision lane up, and time-wise, that vision lane takes a lot of time, And so yeah, but it was essentially taking this deck and boiling it down to something that could be expressed on a page, and it was quite a journey. I remember that project very well.
Um, your experience in the Navy, I mean, again, I look at the work you guys do, and it seems like you need a lot of discipline to do it. Would you say there is a kind of a military discipline to doing this kind of these kind of visual layouts, or?
I mean, I think discipline is certainly there. I mean, I would say, for me, the bigger issue is you're walking this line every day between, they don't want to take time to get you up to speed. They want you to walk in with some knowledge of what they're doing. And I mean, the topics that my designers are working on every day are, you would not believe. We're 1 minute doing cloud strategy for the Air Force. The next minute we're talking about technology for the Postal Service. I mean, those are pretty broad things, and so how do you walk that line where you can get up to speed fast enough on the lexicon and the content that they want you to consume, but also maintaining this almost third-party view, because they do view us as outsiders a little bit. Hey, we brought these guys in who sort of know our world, but we really want to get their take on our plans or our strategy. So it's sort of like walking in as a third-party set of eyes and being able to immerse ourselves fast enough. And so I hire a lot of what I call subject matter experts, third-party SMEs, who will sort of come in, and we don't need a ton of their time, but they'll help orient our team. And so, I mean, like, I didn't know anything about, the topic I'm going to be talking about had to do with like solving back orders for aircraft inventory for, a new naval aircraft. I mean, I don't have a background in inventory or logistics or supply chain, but we had to get up to speed very quickly on that topic. And so, yeah, so I think we're very good at, so the discipline part to me is a lot of research, a lot of both primary engaging with people like doing ethnography work, but also just digging deep into the content, and also using the Google very well as well, of like, how do you constantly find, I like to joke there's only like 5 problems in DC at any one time, but so how did we take a look at like a risk management framework for cybersecurity? How do you visualize that, and how other people are doing it? And so there's a lot of research, and that part is a tedious and also a real demanding process.
Right, but I would imagine, like you're describing, good agencies, I think good designers, good teams, you do a bit of reflecting back to the client, so that I guess I'm getting that impression from you, that you kind of, here's what we see you guys do, and what's your feedback on this? So you're not kind of coming off as telling the client, acting like a know-it-all,
sure,
but kind of reflecting back.
And to your point, we have a methodology.
Yeah.
I don't know that ours is all that different than others. So explore, envision, execute methodology, and we are pretty adamant that we follow that through time after time. But I would say part of it is how you work with the client in a way that feels very teach them how to fish kind of approach, where we're doing it together. My experience of being on the buying side of the house and the selling side of the house is the buyers don't like to feel like there's a black box. There's this agency offsite, and they're going to go come up with the answer. A lot of folks want to be in the sausage making. But the other reason that this methodology has been so fruitful for us is that the level of digital sort of innovation we've been asked to do is really going, really going crazy. So it was a flat map, and now it's a flat map with clickable interface, and now it's a video, and then it's a VR experience and an AR experience. And so we had to have a way to make sure that if we went through that first pass and getting the core metaphor down in the map, now there's a chance to sort of keep building on that in more and more experiential ways. And so that's one way we kind of kept it straight.
So you've mentioned before you were a technical guy. Did you start as a designer, or?
I was a computer scientist.
Computer scientist.
Yeah.
Wow. Yeah. So Dan Rome, is that his name? Mm-hmm. Would he be your visual guy? Is that?
I mean, yeah, he is a good friend and collaborator, and yeah, he he and I probably worked on 20 projects together. And but
Oh,
he's an
okay.
author. He's a best-selling author who wrote the book called The Back of the Napkin. And a
Right.
little bit of his whole approach is, how do you train people who don't consider themselves artists to pick up the pencil and go to the whiteboard?
Yeah.
And he gives them a framework for, how do you, he likes to say, he who can draw the problem has the best chance of solving it. And
Hmm.
so how do you get up on the whiteboard and draw the problem? So I've been through a lot of Dan Rome training for sure.
Okay. So there are a lot of designers, visual artists out there. It's very competitive. What do you say to a young, inexperienced designer who wants to launch their own design business?
Well, I would say three things. I think first, build your tribe. And you might be surprised of where that tribe could come from. It might be through your
Hmm.
family or internships you had, or it might be through people affiliated with school. But I have a little project where I'm working on sort of help people tilt their social media as they're coming from school into the professional world. How do I find all those folks that maybe are Facebook friends or Instagram people, and move them more into a professional, tribe as well. So I think building your tribe is the first. I think second, I think being focused is incredibly important. Pick a look or a niche or a concept that you really enjoy building upon and feel comfort in. And then third, one thing I would say is, we hire and recruit a ton of people out of school, a lot in this sort of design strategy phase, as well as studio designers and illustrators. I find sometimes, though, as the design industry has become so specific and really exploded, a design thinking, thing,
Yeah.
for instance, I find more and more that I have people who, and a friend of mine uses the idea of T-shaped people, right? People that are sort of horizontal, who can play a lot of roles versus very vertical. And I find right now I have a lot of folks coming out of school who have a very vertical role. I want to do service design work for consumer my first job. And so I think that the idea of, what is so powerful about designers around empathy and evolving and learning and being adaptable are skill sets that we don't want to forget, even as the design industry itself is becoming more competitive and more filled with folks. So I think being a horizontal type designer is what we certainly look for.
Okay, great. So last question. This year marks the 100th anniversary of the Bauhaus School of Design out of Germany. 100 years ago, so designers were really focused on geometry and kind of abandoning the ornate decoration of the past. And from Bauhaus School of Design, you have more modern approach to design. So modern day furniture and skyscrapers and buildings made of glass and geometric shapes and etc. This was revolutionary, and it corresponded with the Industrial Revolution. How does Maga Design continue the Bauhaus legacy, if it does, or how are things different today than from 100 years ago, and how is Maga differ?
Sure. I mean, I don't know as much about Bauhaus as I probably should, but from a time frame perspective, we're talking sort of post World War II or coming out of World War II and all the
Yeah.
changes that were occurring there. I mean, I personally think that we need to be very focused on what's going on around us from a business and from an ROI and from an impact perspective in the design work that we do. And so I would just say that right now we're having an explosion in all kinds of a fourth industrial revolution, driverless cars and AI and Internet of Things and all these elements. And I think how do we develop even things that are sort of those functional mundane things like furniture for the house, or the kind of notebook I want to use, or adaptions for whatever, clothing, watches, etc. But I think always keeping an eye between those functional things in life and what's going on in the sort of industry writ large. And yeah, having come from the military, the military, and our part of the military did a lot of work with NASA as well because of aviation. And so, in our world, the people from the community I'm from, felt like things like Wi-Fi, things like GPSs, all these technologies came from or came out of sort of military type investment, the internet itself. And
Yeah.
so I think that when I think of Bauhaus and how it was maybe a reaction to coming out of that time, we can, as Maga, we're continuously trying to also pay attention to what's happening sort of at an industrial level, coming out of this R&D, and how do those things apply in how we communicate to people. One thing I'll just follow on is I'm doing some work right now around the airman experience for the Air Force, and we constantly talk about what the young 18-year-old, 19-year-old that's enlisting or going to an academy or a
Yeah.
service academy. They want to have an experience. It's like an Amazon experience, or it's
Yeah.
like, so sort of like we constantly need to be looking at what we're using in our real life and designing that backwards into our work world as well. So, to me, those are a couple of thoughts when I think of the Bauhaus revolution.
Yeah, that's interesting. I had an interview with Stephen Gates recently, and he was talking about he had different words, but a similar answer. And he basically landed on, today it's much more about designing experience because so much design remains virtual now, where back then it was, you were designing things, or even your graphics were posters to be printed or what have you. But nowadays it's virtual and it's disposable. So what happens is we shift into what kind of experience is the person I'm communicating with having or going to have, which I think directly correlates with what you just said. I mean, the millennial Navy pilot, is probably very different from my brother-in-law, who's about 10 years older than me. I'm a Gen Xer. Him getting behind an A6 versus this kid jumping in a plane now. I'm just curious. I'm wondering what kind of a difference that is. But
yeah.
Anything jump out at you there specifically? The difference between the old generation and the new?